A very warm welcome, Charmaine. Thank you so much for joining me, and a very warm welcome to our viewers. Thank you for tuning into today's chat with Charmaine Roche, who is an accredited executive coach and leadership supervisor, and a PhD researcher at Leeds Beckett University, and a podcaster. We are here to talk about the groundbreaking global research project exploring the views of Black, Indigenous, and other coaches of color, and about what the world of coaching needs to do to take an anti-racist approach. So my name is Jenny Stricker. I'm a member of EMCC Luxembourg. We hope to dig into Charmaine Roche's research together with Jonathan Passmore. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining me. Would you mind just sharing a bit about your research?
I'm currently, as you said, a student at Leeds Beckett University, a PhD student. And the topic of my research is the ethics of coaching for social change in contexts of oppression. Bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
And when I originally started my research journey, the issue of race wasn't anywhere on the radar. I was particularly concerned as a practitioner working in the public sector with what I perceive to be the oppressive culture of performativity, and the clash in values that created between the service providers and the system, which made those service providers feel that they were not meeting the needs of the service users. So just to give an example from my own life, before I became a coach, I was working in the education sector, and I was a teacher, head teacher. When I left the profession, I was a head teacher. And I left because I could no longer live in that system. It felt like an existential threat to me. I had to leave in order to save my life. And that might sound quite dramatic, but that's how it felt. And the culture of performativity was experienced by me as an oppressive context. When I started to coach in that context, I started to ask myself the question, is it ethical to coach people to improve their performance against the criteria of excellence developed against performativity as a culture? Yeah. Is it ethical to coach within that performance sort of agenda rather than to challenge the agenda? Because people are coming to me stressed, anxious, burnt out or at risk of burnout. And the coaching modalities that I was using tended to put the emphasis on them changing themselves rather than challenging the system. Yeah. This is where the research with Jonathan came in. So it was almost like an accident, really, the research project with Jonathan. He was looking for a researcher. He'd been looking since the murder of George Floyd triggered him to think about why coaching wasn't having a conversation about race, which at that point it wasn't. It was like a resounding silence. And we refer to this in the report that we've written. And I'll just name the report because I would like your listeners, after listening to this conversation, to read that report, to study it, to discuss it with their colleagues, and to take some proactive actions on their own behalf or collectively with others. That's the purpose, that's the reason why we did the research. It was an accident. So Jonathan was asking this question, why aren't we discussing race as a profession? Why is it not on our agenda? Particularly when there are visible structural issues. Yeah. But it was mainly anecdotal. You know, the sense that coaching was very white was anecdotal because as a profession, we've done no research. So when he was looking for a researcher, and we happened upon each other, and I asked him if there was any projects that I could collaborate on. Yeah. And he mentioned this research and he was looking for someone. I said, yes, I just leapt at it because instinctively I felt a connection between this opportunity and the research I'd already started to do.
Yeah.
And what that research project enabled me to see was that coaching itself, it's not just the culture of some of the workplaces that can be oppressive that we work in as coaches, but coaching itself can be experienced as an oppressive context by certain people. And that's what came out from the research that I did with the coaches.
I read the report and you included a lot of different nationalities. It was quite a big research.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you tell more about how you got on, how that happened?
Yeah, that was due to Jonathan's vision for the research.
Yeah.
So he constructed a steering group, an international steering group.
Yeah.
And the countries that were represented on that steering group was the UK, South Africa, USA, and New Zealand. And there were members of universities who were also coaches or coach trainers,
yeah,
who were members of the steering group. And I joined that steering group as the principal researcher. So the steering group already existed and they were looking for a researcher. So I joined that group as the principal researcher. But it was that vision that was already there that Jonathan had brought to wanting to make it a global. The steering group was structured so that when we went out to look for participants, the participants would reflect the membership of the steering group. That makes sense.
So how did racism show up?
Well, I would just like to say a little bit about that because it's not principally about ending racism. It's about systemic racism.
Yeah.
And I make that distinction because we're not saying that this research is targeting individual racists, because it's not.
No.
There is no assumption that the research is identifying individualized forms of racism. What it's identifying is structural and systemic forms of racism. And anti-racism is specifically a stance that identifies systemic and structural racism and seeks to, through identifying it, challenge it and dismantle it. That is what anti-racism means within the context of this report and within the context of the theoretical models that we use to analyse the data. And I think that's important because I think one of the limitations of some of the initial responses to the report is that it focused on coaches themselves becoming more aware and therefore challenging their own internal biases or unconscious bias. But this report isn't really about that. That is maybe part of the picture, but it's actually a bigger picture that we're drawing attention to, which is the structure of the industry itself and its underpinning norms, which principally come from a very westernized neoliberal perspective.
So that systemic racism, how would you encourage us coaches to help spread the word, so to say? Or?
The first step is about consciousness. It's about consciousness raising. The research base in coaching tends to be very celebratory of coaching, which is in and of itself is not. We didn't go into coaching in order to do it down, to say that it was rubbish or that it, to erode confidence in it as a form of human development. I wouldn't be doing coaching if I didn't think it was a meaningful practice.
Yeah, of course.
However, as an uncritical practice, it can be dangerous. So for me, I think the first work we need to do as a profession is to become more critical, be more critically aware of what it means to coach in certain contexts, to coach certain people with certain lived experiences of systems in which coaching is a part, because we don't live outside of society. Coaching as a profession is part of society, and as such, it reflects the rest of society. To me, that's a no-brainer. I think those of us who, whether it's because of race or because of gender or because of neurodiversity or sexual identity, have come against systems that we experience as oppressive, we have more of a critical lens, but certainly the coaches I interviewed had a very critical lens as a result of their lived experiences and their professional experiences. So I think it's about opening up our consciousness to ways of being which are not normal to ourselves by virtue of our own lived experience. We may not know what it is to be a Black person or a person of colour, an Indigenous person from New Zealand or South Africa. There are these experiences which are not part of our own experience, and we need to open ourselves to what we don't know and be more critical. And then to ask ourselves, so what difference does this make to the way that we practice? And it's not an individual responsibility, it's a collective responsibility. But we are all responsible for our own being and our own use of power. So that's where we need to do the self-work.
So do you think it's enough to be aware and be critical about the problem?
No, it's a starting point.
Okay.
But I also think we need to be critical of our agendas for change. So, you know, the research has got a set of recommendations.
Yes.
Top recommendations is about increasing representation.
Yes.
Increasing diversity in the profession. So one of the findings of the research, which should have been no surprise to anybody, the coaches talked about this, the coach providers talked about this, the coach trainers acknowledged that the profession is very white. I think there was a bit more of a denial in some of the professional associations at that time, but things have shifted since then. I think things have radically shifted in terms of the willingness to now have conversations about this. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that's taken place since the time the report was published and now. So what was revealed by the coaches, and this was a real learning for me as well, is that for them they had a more social conception of coaching rather than an individualized conception of coaching. For them it wasn't just about transforming individuals in order to be able to perform better in a corporate setting. No. It was about enabling people who are marginalized and excluded in those settings to be more empowered. And that meant challenging structures in those settings. Now, if you're joining a coaching pool that is interested in that, you're going to feel like a prisoner in that coaching pool. You're not going to feel that you belong. You're not going to feel integrated or included because your perspective won't be welcomed. So just adding colour to a white coaching pool is not the answer. And representation that starts and stops there is just a tick box, which addresses nothing.
I think that's so important, actually, because that's also what we see in a lot of HR organizations, that it's a tick box exercise, but there's more to it.
Absolutely. It's a much deeper question. Much deeper.
So what's your vision?
Because I don't think there are any easy answers to any of this. You know, I think we have to co-create solutions across all the full diversity of our humanity. You know, diversity isn't just something that pertains to Black people or people of colour.
No,
we're all humanity is diverse by its very nature. The fact that we live in a systems that stratify us or have racialized us or have gender biases and all these things do violence to our diversity. So if I have a vision, it's that we can create a world together which isn't stratified in these ways. Our economic models, our social models, our political models no longer have any tolerance working from these assumptions about our diverse humanity. I am not someone to be put in a box because of the colour of my skin or my gender or any other aspect of my identity. Identity itself is complex and changing and in flux, and box ticking is a violence to the complexity of the reality in which we live and our desire for relational freedom. And I say relational freedom because it's not just about individual freedom. It's about, you know, what it means. What do I need to do for you to be free? It's relational. And this is a concept which is almost alien to individualized psychological models or sort of neoliberal individualism, which boils everything down to individual freedom, which is actually not real. It's an illusion anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
And the danger with coaching is that if it buys into this illusion, it propagates an illusion which is quite damaging. To be free from this, to be free from these illusions, and to work with our very complex, diverse humanity,
Yeah.
In ways which are mutually empowering, I think. Yeah, and we can create, limiting systems, because it's not just self-limiting ideas we have to challenge, it's social structures.
Yeah. That's challenge the social structure is where we can start, as we talked about earlier, and being critical. Is there anything else that you wish that we all knew? So, and what we could do to challenge this system?
All I can say to you, Jenny, is what I've learned myself, because I'm not about prescribing things to people. I think the research speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And then I've made my own learning. I'm on my own journey. Yeah. And I would say is that this dialectic between ourselves and the system is important.
Yeah.
To understand that while there is a system which is out there and independent of us, we exist in an interdependent connection to that system.
Yeah. So
we are in the system and the system is in us. So even the smallest thing that we do to challenge or disrupt systemic structures that we feel are oppressive in any way will have an impact. Whether we do that as an individual or we do that collectively, it will have an impact, because the system doesn't exist independently of our own individual connection to it. There is that interconnection. Yes. And that is what I think is the most powerful thing I have learned.
Yeah.
And I play with that, I experiment with that in my one-to-one work, in my work with groups, the courses that I run, whether I'm a coaching or I'm a supervisor, in my writing, my research. That is the core of what I play with, that dialectical relationship between the self and the system.
Yeah.
Because that, I believe, is where our power lies, is in that connection.
Excellent.
Our ability to make change.
Thank you so much for taking your time and being part of this conversation. I think it's really, really important. And you have challenged my thinking on, playing with this systemic thinking and the individual, where we all in this system. And I think it's really important to take that note when we leave this conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.